Step into the darkness where reality blurs and nightmares come alive. The day we inherited the doll was the beginning of the end. It all started when my grandmother passed away. She was a kind and gentle soul, the heart and soul of our family. Her passing left a void in our lives that we struggled to fill. But amidst the grief, there was a glimmer of hope, a letter from her lawyer informing us that we had inherited something from her estate. We gathered in my parents' living room as the lawyer read out the contents of the will. Among the various bequests was a mention of an old doll that had belonged to my grandmother's grandmother. The lawyer warned us that there were rumors of a sinister presence surrounding the doll, but we paid little heed to his words. After all, what harm could an old doll possibly do? That night, as we packed up my grandmother's belongings, I stumbled upon the doll tucked away in a dusty old trunk in the attic. It was a strange-looking thing, with cracked porcelain skin and faded, glassy eyes that seemed to follow me wherever I went. Despite its eerie appearance, I felt strangely drawn to it, as if it held some kind of power over me. I brought the doll down to the living room and showed it to my parents and siblings. They were all fascinated by it, marveling at its intricate details and the sense of history it seemed to possess. We decided to keep it as a memento of my grandmother, a reminder of the love and warmth she had brought into our lives. But from the moment the doll entered our home, things began to change. Strange occurrences became commonplace, a door slamming shut on its own, footsteps echoing through the empty halls in the dead of night, and the feeling of being watched when no one else was around. At first, we brushed it off as mere coincidence, but as the incidents grew more frequent and more sinister, we began to question whether there was something truly malevolent at work. Then, one evening, my sister Emma claimed to have seen the doll move. She was sitting alone in the living room when she caught sight of it out of the corner of her eye. At first, she thought it was just a trick of the light, but when she looked again, she saw its head turn ever so slightly, as if it were watching her. We laughed it off at first, dismissing it as a figment of her imagination. But deep down, we couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The atmosphere in the house grew increasingly tense, our once close-knit family drifting further and further apart as fear and suspicion took hold. Then, one night, everything changed. I woke up to the sound of screams echoing through the house. Rushing downstairs, I found my parents in the living room, their faces pale with terror. They pointed to the doll sitting on the mantel, its glassy eyes gleaming with an otherworldly light. "It moved," my mother whispered, her voice trembling with fear. I saw it with my own eyes. It moved. I tried to reassure her, to convince her that she was imagining things. But deep down, I knew she was telling the truth. The doll had moved, of that I was certain. And as I looked into its unblinking eyes, I felt a chill run down my spine, a sense of dread unlike anything I had ever known. From that moment on, the doll's presence in our home became a source of constant terror. My parents grew increasingly paranoid, their minds consumed by the fear that the doll was watching them, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. They tried to get rid of it, to throw it away or burn it in the fireplace, but no matter what they did, it always found its way back into our home. And then, the nightmares began. Horrific, vivid dreams that left us waking in a cold sweat, our hearts pounding in our chests. Dreams of the doll stalking us through the darkness, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light as it whispered promises of death and destruction. But it wasn't just the nightmares that haunted us. Strange things began to happen during the day as well, objects moving on their own, strange symbols appearing on the walls, and the feeling of being watched no matter where we went. It was as if the doll's malevolent spirit had seeped into every corner of our home, twisting and distorting reality until we could no longer trust our own senses. And then, one by one, my family began to change. They became distant, withdrawn, their minds consumed by a madness that seemed to have no end. My sister Emma was the first to go, her once bright eyes now dull and lifeless as she wandered the halls of our home, muttering to herself incoherently. Next was my mother. She became obsessed with the doll, spending hours locked away in her room, performing strange rituals and chanting incantations in a desperate bid to appease its malevolent spirit. But no matter what she did, the doll's influence only grew stronger, its dark presence looming over our lives like a shadow. And then, one night, the madness reached its breaking point. I woke up to the sound of screams echoing through the house, the air thick with the smell of blood and death. Rushing downstairs, I found my father standing over my mother's lifeless body, his hands covered in blood and his eyes wild with madness. "It was the doll," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the din. "The doll made me do it." I wanted to believe him, to believe that the doll was responsible for the horrors that had befallen our family. But deep down, I knew the truth. The doll was just a vessel, a conduit for the darkness that lurked within our own hearts. And as I stood in the wreckage of our once happy home, surrounded by the carnage and chaos that had torn my family apart, I knew that there was only one thing left to do. I had to destroy the doll, to rid our lives of its malevolent presence once and for all. But as I reached out to pick it up, a chill ran down my spine, a sense of foreboding unlike anything I had ever known. And as I looked into its glassy eyes, I saw something staring back at me, a flicker of malevolence that sent a shiver down my spine. With a sense of dread weighing heavy on my heart, I raised the doll above my head and brought it crashing down onto the hard wooden floor. And as its porcelain body shattered into a million pieces, I felt a sense of relief wash over me, a sense of freedom from the darkness that had haunted us for so long. But as I turned to leave, a voice whispered in the darkness, a voice that chilled me to the bone and filled me with a sense of dread unlike anything I had ever known. "You can destroy the doll," it whispered, its words echoing through the empty halls of our once happy home. "But you cannot destroy me. I will always be with you, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike." And as I stumbled out into the cold night air, I knew that the nightmare was far from over, that the darkness that had consumed my family was still out there, waiting for its next victim. And as I looked back at the ruins of our home, I knew that the horror was just beginning.